Moses was the greatest prophet in the Bible. He parted the Red Sea and spoke to God face to face. But when he died, there was no state funeral, no monument, no tomb. He walked up a mountain alone, and God himself acted as the cosmic undertaker, burying Moses in an unmarked grave that no human being has found in 3,000 years. But the story does not end there. The moment Moses stopped breathing, a terrifying sequence of supernatural events was unleashed. A brutal legal war broke out between an archangel and the devil over his physical remains. And a cosmic appointment was locked into the calendar of heaven that would not be fulfilled for another 1,400 years. Today, we are opening a 3,000-year-old cold case. These are the 6 shocking things that happened after God buried Moses. Let us uncover the truth. Event 1. The unmarked burial in Moab. The first detail the forensic record gives us about Moses' death is the one most people read past without stopping. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 7. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. Read that carefully. Moses did not die of old age in the conventional sense. He did not fade. He did not deteriorate. There was no prolonged illness, no cognitive decline, no physical wasting. At 120 years old, Moses had the biology of a man in his prime. His eyes were sharp. His strength was intact. The text is not being poetic. It is giving us a clinical observation. The man was physically preserved at the moment of his death in a condition that defies the normal trajectory of human aging. This is the first anomaly in the cold case file, and it demands a question that most readers never ask. Why did God preserve Moses' physical condition so precisely at the moment of death? Why did it matter that his body was in peak condition when he died? If this was simply the end of Moses' story, the state of his biology at death would be irrelevant. But God does not include irrelevant details in Scripture. Every forensic clue in this text is pointing somewhere. The destination will not become clear for another 1,400 years. The second anomaly is the grave itself. God buries Moses in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. And then Deuteronomy records something extraordinary. No one knows the place of his burial to this day. God hid it, not negligently, not accidentally, deliberately. The Creator of the universe, who knows the location of every grain of sand on every shoreline of every ocean, concealed the burial site of his servant with such precision that 3,000 years of human investigation has failed to find it. The question is, why? The answer requires understanding something about the psychology of Israel that the text makes explicit through a single incident. When Moses climbed Sinai to receive the law, he was gone for 40 days. 40 days. The people of Israel, the same people who had watched the Red Sea open and close, who had eaten bread that materialized from the sky every morning, who had followed a pillar of fire through a desert at night, became so destabilized by 40 days without their leader that they melted their gold jewelry, constructed a calf, and declared it to be the god that brought them out of Egypt. 40 days without Moses produced a golden calf. Now, consider what the Israelites would have done with his bones. His physical remains would have become the most powerful religious relic in the ancient Near East within hours of his burial. They would have built a shrine. They would have constructed a priesthood around the shrine. They would have turned the deliverer into a deity, and the covenant mediator into an idol. God did not hide Moses' grave to be mysterious. He hid it because he understood exactly what the people he loved would do with it. He permanently removed the object of their potential idolatry before they had the chance to kneel before it. God will bury what you would worship before you have the opportunity to build a shrine around it. Event 2. The 30 days of national mourning. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days. That is the clinical record. 30 days of national mourning on the eastern bank of the Jordan River, staring across the water at the land God had promised them, with the man who had led them out of Egypt lying in an unmarked grave somewhere in the hills behind them. To read that as simple grief is to miss the full weight of what was happening on those plains. Consider the specific situation of these people in this specific moment. They are not standing in a comfortable location with time to process their loss. They are a nation of former slaves, recently emerged from 40 years in a hostile desert, camped on the border of a land populated by cities with walls that reach the sky and soldiers that make the Israelite scouts feel like grasshoppers. The Book of Numbers records the report of those scouts in detail. The land devours its inhabitants. The people are of great height. The sons of Anak are there, descendants of the Nephilim. Against those men we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers. That was the intelligence report. Giant fortified cities, warrior cultures that had never been defeated, and the man who held the staff that parted the Red Sea, the man whose presence had been the single most stabilizing force in their national psychology for 40 years, was gone. And there is a detail that the text does not explicitly state, but that the timeline makes unmistakable. The manna stopped. Exodus records that the manna appeared every morning for 40 years in the wilderness, never failing, never varying, arriving with the regularity of a divine alarm clock. Joshua chapter 5 verse 12 records that the manna ceased on the day after the Passover, the day after they ate the produce of the land of Canaan. The manna stopped when they crossed the Jordan. But Moses died before the crossing, which means the people standing on the plains of Moab were not only grieving their leader, they were standing in a location where the supernatural food supply that had sustained them for 4 decades was about to end, staring at an enemy they did not believe they could defeat, without the man who had been the visible proof that God was with them. This was not a period of reflection. This was a national psychological crisis. They were caught in the most dangerous position a human being or a nation can occupy. Behind them was the wilderness. 40 years of desert survival, supernatural provision, and the slow, grinding education of a slave people being remade into a covenant nation. They could not go back. There was nothing to return to. The wilderness had done its work and closed behind them like a door. Ahead of them was the promise. But the promise required warfare, and warfare required a general, and the general they had known and trusted was in an unmarked grave in Moab. They were standing between a past that was finished and a future that terrified them, paralyzed by 30 days of grief that was really 30 days of fear dressed in the clothing of mourning. God watched them weep for 30 days. He gave them the full measure of their grief. He did not rush the process or minimize the loss. Moses was genuinely irreplaceable in the history of Israel, and God did not pretend otherwise. And then on the 31st day, God broke the silence. Event 3. The transfer of the spirit of wisdom. Before the silence broke, something happened that the text records quietly, but with enormous theological significance. Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 9. Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. The mantle did not pass through a vote. It did not pass through a committee or a period of institutional discernment or a democratic process by which the people of Israel selected their next leader from a field of qualified candidates. It passed through a physical act of anointing performed before Moses died, and it was ratified by God, filling Joshua with the spirit of wisdom the moment Moses was gone. The succession was not a human administrative decision, It was a divine appointment, executed with the same surgical precision as every other detail surrounding Moses' death. And the nature of the appointment reveals something critical about what was coming next. Moses was a shepherd, not metaphorically. Before the burning bush, before the plagues, before the Red Sea, Moses spent 40 years in the Midianite wilderness tending the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro. His entire formation before his prophetic ministry was the formation of a man who leads by presence, by care, by staying with the flock through every season of wandering. The desert required a shepherd. A man who could sustain 2 million people through 40 years of supernatural provision and incremental covenantal formation required the patience, the gentleness, and the endurance of someone who understood how to keep a flock alive through a long and difficult journey with no fixed destination in sight. But the Jordan was not the wilderness. Canaan was not a place to be shepherded through. It was a place to be conquered. The cities on the other side of the river did not require patience and provision. They required assault, strategy, and the willingness to take ground by force. God did not need a shepherd for what came next. He needed a general. And Joshua, whose military formation had begun at Rephidim when he commanded Israel's first battle against Amalek, while Moses held his arms aloft on the hill, was the precise instrument God had been preparing for this specific assignment. The shift from Moses to Joshua was not a crisis of succession. It was a deliberate recalibration of leadership for a new phase of the mission. Before we look at the exact, ruthless words God used to break the 30 days of silence, if this is changing how you see the Bible, hit the subscribe button to Bible Origins right now. It is the best way to support the channel so we can continue bringing you these deep investigations. Event 4. The military command at Jordan. And then God spoke. Joshua chapter 1 verse 2. Moses my servant is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them. Read the tone of that sentence carefully. There is no eulogy in it. There is no acknowledgement of the weight of what Israel had just lost, or the magnitude of the grief that had consumed the nation for 30 days. There is no transitional phrase, no gentle pastoral acknowledgement of the difficulty of the moment. God breaks 30 days of national mourning with a military order delivered in the flat, precise register of a commanding officer who has just been informed that one of his officers has fallen and is now redirecting the mission to the next man in line. Moses, my servant, is dead. It is a statement of fact, unadorned, unsentimentalized. The greatest prophet in Israel's history, the man who had stood between the nation and the wrath of God on multiple occasions, the man who had been the visible face of the covenant for 40 years, is summarized in 4 words. Moses, my servant, is dead. And the next word is now. Not eventually. Not when you are ready. Not after an appropriate period of institutional transition and collective healing. Now. God does not pause his eternal timeline for human grief. The era of Moses is over. The mission continues. The river is ahead. Arise.
Event 5. The supernatural dispute over Moses' body. While the Israelites were weeping on the plains of Moab and God was preparing Joshua for command, something else was happening, something the text of Deuteronomy does not record because it was not visible to any human observer, something that only one letter in the entire New Testament pulls back the curtain to reveal. Jude chapter 1 verse 9. But when the Archangel Michael, contending with the devil, was disputing about the body of Moses, he did not presume to pronounce a blasphemous judgment but said, "The Lord rebuke you." Read that verse slowly. The Archangel Michael, one of the highest-ranking beings in the celestial hierarchy, the warrior angel whose name means "who is like God," was in an active dispute with Satan over the physical body of Moses. Not Moses' soul, not Moses' spiritual legacy, his body, the specific physical remains of a 120-year-old man lying in an unmarked grave in a valley in Moab. Why did the devil want a dead body? The answer requires understanding what Satan was actually arguing. He was not making an emotional claim, he was not expressing a preference or registering a complaint, he was prosecuting a legal case. Satan was claiming jurisdictional authority over Moses' physical remains based on the legal principle that death is the consequence of sin and that Moses, as a sinner, was subject to that consequence in the fullest sense. But Satan's legal argument was more specific than the general sinfulness of humanity. Moses was a murderer. Exodus chapter 2 records it plainly. Moses saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, looked around, saw no one watching, and struck the Egyptian dead. He buried the body in the sand. He fled when the crime was discovered. The man who would become the lawgiver of Israel had broken the law of God before he received it. The man who would stand on Sinai and receive the command, "You shall not murder," had blood on his hands from a crime committed in Egypt decades before the law was given. Satan's legal argument before whatever tribunal was convened over that unmarked grave in Moab was this: Moses is a murderer. A murderer belongs to the realm of death. I have legal jurisdiction over this body. Hand it over. It was not an irrational argument. It was not a desperate claim made without legal foundation. Under the strict application of the law that Moses himself had delivered, the argument had standing. The lawgiver had broken the law. The wages of sin is death. He wanted the body. Why? Because a body is a weapon. The same people who built a golden calf in 40 days would have built a temple around the bones of Moses in 40 hours. Satan wanted to use the physical remains of Israel's greatest prophet to achieve what he had always been trying to achieve since the garden: the corruption of worship, the redirection of devotion away from God and toward a created thing. He wanted to turn Moses into an idol, prove that the law had failed even in its greatest human representative, and weaponize the grief of a traumatized nation against the God who loved them. Michael did not argue the case on the merits. Michael did not compile evidence of Moses' righteousness or construct a theological defense of God's right to grant mercy. Michael said 4 words: "The Lord rebuke you, not I rebuke you." Michael does not claim the authority in his own name. He appeals to a higher jurisdiction. He invokes the name and the authority of the God who is above every legal claim, every covenantal violation, every accusation that can be leveled against any human being who has ever lived. Grace was the only defense available, and grace was sufficient. Satan was denied his prize. The body stayed hidden, the grave remained sealed, and God was not finished with Moses yet. VNT 6. The reappearance on the Mount of Transfiguration. For 1,400 years the grave stayed hidden. Empires rose and collapsed. The Israelites crossed the Jordan and conquered Canaan under Joshua. The period of the judges came and went. Saul was anointed and failed. David was anointed and built a kingdom. Solomon constructed the temple. The kingdom split. The northern tribes fell to Assyria. Jerusalem fell to Babylon. The exile lasted 70 years. The Persian Empire replaced Babylon. Ezra and Nehemiah led a partial return. The Greek Empire superseded Persia. Alexander the Great swept through the known world. The Maccabees revolted. Herod built his palace. Caesar issued his decrees. 1,400 years of human history accumulated over that unmarked grave in the valley of Moab, and the body stayed hidden. Satan's claim was denied at every point. The forensic evidence that God had preserved with such deliberate care remained sealed in the earth, waiting for a specific moment on a specific mountain that was still more than a millennium away. Matthew chapter 17, verse 1. After 6 days Jesus took with him Peter and James and John his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And then the text records one of the most extraordinary events in the entire New Testament, with the same clinical brevity that Scripture reserves for its most world-altering moments. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. Moses and Elijah, 2 figures stepping physically out of eternity to stand on a mountain in Galilee and hold a conversation with the Son of God. And between those two names, one of them lands with a weight that should stop every reader completely. Moses, the man buried in the unmarked grave in Moab. The man whose body Satan disputed in the heavenly court. The man whose eye was undimmed and whose vigor was unabated at the moment of death. That body, preserved with supernatural precision 14 centuries earlier, standing on the Mount of Transfiguration, face to face with the one it had been preserved to meet. Now the forensic case resolves. The undimmed eye at death was not a biological anomaly. It was a divine preservation protocol. God was maintaining the physical integrity of a body that had a specific appointment on a specific mountain 1400 years in the future. The hidden grave was not secrecy for its own sake. It was the protective seal on a body that Satan was trying to steal and weaponize. The denied legal claim in Jude was not simply a victory for Michael. It was the protection of an instrument God had not yet finished using. Moses did not appear on the Mount of Transfiguration as a spectator or a guest of honor. He appeared as a representative. He was the embodiment of the law, the covenant of Sinai, the entire system of divine instruction that had governed the relationship between God and Israel for 14 centuries. And he appeared on that mountain to do something that the text does not explicitly state, but that the theology of the entire New Testament makes unmistakable. He handed the baton over. The lawgiver stood before the fulfillment of the law. The mediator of the Old Covenant stood before the mediator of the New Covenant. The one who had carried the weight of the law from Sinai to the plains of Moab stood before the one who would carry that weight all the way to a cross outside Jerusalem and absorb its full penalty on behalf of every person who had ever failed to keep it. The Old Covenant did not fade away quietly or expire without ceremony. It was handed over personally, physically, on a mountain by the man who had delivered it. Moses gave it to Jesus, and then Moses returned to eternity, his assignment finally and completely fulfilled. Everyone assumes the hardest thing to leave behind is a sin, the addiction, the anger, the pattern of behavior that has caused damage for years. But Deuteronomy reveals a different and more dangerous category of loss. The hardest thing to leave behind is not a sin, it is a dead blessing. Moses was not a failure. Moses was not a mistake. Moses was the instrument through which God delivered an entire people from 400 years of slavery, sustained them for 40 years in a desert, gave them their legal and moral framework, and he walked them to the edge of everything they had been promised. Moses was an objective good, a genuine miracle, a gift of incalculable value, and God buried him. Not because Moses had failed, not because the season of Moses was a mistake that needed to be corrected, but because Israel could not carry the manna of the wilderness into the warfare of their future. The provision that had sustained them through the desert would become an idol if they tried to import it into a new season that required something completely different from them. God did not bury Moses to punish Israel, he buried Moses to free them. Now consider your own life with the same forensic honesty. What Moses are you crying over right now? What season, what relationship, what ministry, what version of yourself used to provide you with everything you needed and has now gone silent and cold? That thing was real. God genuinely used it. The manna was not imaginary, the provision was not a lie, the season was good and you are right to grieve its ending. But you are standing on the plains of Moab. Behind you is a wilderness that has closed. Ahead of you is a promise that requires a different kind of faith than the one that got you through the desert. And you are paralyzed because the thing you loved most is in the ground, and you are still facing the direction of the grave instead of the direction of the river. You are not waiting for a resurrection, God is handing you a shovel. The dead blessing must stay buried, because you cannot enter your inheritance carrying the weight of what was never meant to cross the Jordan with you. Here is the final piece of the forensic case, and it has been hiding in plain sight inside a name for 3,000 years. The man God chose to replace Moses was named Joshua. In the Hebrew language, the name Joshua is Yeshua, the same name that the angel Gabriel gave to a carpenter's son born in Bethlehem 14 centuries after Joshua crossed the Jordan. Yeshua. Jesus. They share the same name because they share the same function. Moses could walk Israel to the edge of the river. He could deliver the law, sustain the people through the wilderness, mediate the covenant, and bring an entire nation to the threshold of everything God had promised them. But Moses could not cross the Jordan. Moses could not secure the inheritance. Moses could not take the people in. The law can show you the promise. The law can expose the distance between where you are and where God intends you to be. But the law has no power to carry you across the waters of death into the life God has prepared for you. It took Yeshua to do that. It took Joshua. It took Jesus. If God has buried a Moses in your life, if a season has ended in ways that felt violent and confusing and completely out of your control, it is not because you are being punished, it is because the era of striving in the wilderness is finished. Grace is taking the lead now. God is breaking the silence over your life today with the same words He spoke to Joshua on the 31st day, "My servant is dead. Now arise,